Maybe just a few more remarks. I don't know if they'll be helpful or not. Again, the best thing to do with this book, like any other text, is simply to read it. But even more so with this book, is really nothing I think that anybody really needs any help with. It's written in such a simple, clear, and really incredibly brilliant way, actually. So just read it. But, it is a work of literature, and I think probably a great work of literature. And one of the signs of that, I believe, is that with a great work of literature, as opposed to, let's say, a really good philosophy essay like Nagel's essay or even Jonas's essay about mortality, that you every time you come back to it, you see something different and you read it differently, and that's because you're different and because the text itself is so rich that things as you read it perhaps at an earlier age that didn't really resonate with you now do, and other things perhaps don't. One of the things that's often said about this work, which is very true, is to pay attention to the title. It's not called Grief Observed, it's called A Grief Observed, emphasizing that it is Lewis's experience as a person that he is coming to terms with, not grief in general. And that is true. And I suppose it wasn't until this time around reading it that it struck me that this is his personal grief, and that part of it is that he's not simply grieving for a person that he loved. When I chose the book, I really, and still emphasize the fact that you can take his personal experience of grief and compare it with the definition of grief that's given by Gustafson in his essay, and that I was thinking, well, it'd be interesting to see, to read together a purely intellectual, philosophical, academic exercise in trying to define grief, and then a very personal, visceral description of an actual person's grieving, and see how they related to one another, which I still think is true. But Lewis, it's not just that he's grieving, and it's not just that it's his grief. It's a particular kind of grief. He's grieving for a spouse, and that is bound to give this a certain character. And it really didn't strike me how important that was until this time around, that he's grieving for his wife. And I think that grief for a spouse is bound to be different from grief for a parent, grief for a friend, grief for a child. All of those things are going to be different types of grief or different experiences of grief over and above the purely personal, individual notion. We all grieve differently, but it depends on who you're grieving for. And in this case, he's grieving for his wife. He's grieving for a spouse. And as I said, that's bound to give it a certain character. Not that it's altogether different from grief for other figures in our lives, but it's bound to be different. And I was looking at this passage on page 47 in chapter 3, where he returns to a thought that he had at the beginning, that grief feels like suspense. He says, I think I am beginning to understand why grief feels like suspense. And think about suspense. Suspense is sort of hanging, a moment of hanging, a moment of hesitation, or being in between two things and looking for some kind of resolution, like in music when you go to the resolution at the end, and the whatever it's called, I can't remember the term for it. It comes from the frustration, and there's another grief, suspense, and frustration. It comes from the frustration of so many impulses that had become habitual. Thought after thought, feeling after feeling, action after action had H for their object. Now their target is gone. It's almost as if you habitually reach out for things that are in your home or your environment. And when they're not there, you have that feeling of suspense, that feeling of the object of your action, which is so familiar is just not there, and you're sort of left hanging, literally suspended. I keep on through habit, fitting an arrow to the string. Then I remember and have to lay the bow down. So many roads lead thought to H. I set out on one of them, but now there's an impassable frontier post across it. So many roads once, now so many cul-de-sacs, so many dead ends. For a good wife contains so many persons in herself. What was H not to me? That this is a book about a man who's lost his wife. It's not about a man who's lost just anybody or who's lost just somebody close to them. Somebody who's lost his wife, and so I think it has to be taken into account. Although I do believe that his experience is universal too, that we can all relate it to people that we've lost who haven't been spouses. So that a lot of what he's going through is I think it wouldn't be in bad taste to say that it's kind of like being dumped. That is, there is that kind of an element of that. That he is obviously the big thing here is that she's died, but through her death, she has in a certain way ended their relationship. So in a certain way, he's been dumped. He's been left by her, and that is, I think, not just a crazy thought, because he has been left by her. He talks about being left by her. He's been left by her for God. And that is one of the elements here I'd like you to think about, is that despite his doubt, and it's a very serious doubt sometimes that he has about whether she still exists in some form, that seems to be a pretty firm belief on his part that she does. But does that make it any easier? I don't know. That's for you to decide. But there is a repeated problem that he has to come to terms with, and that is that he does believe that she is now with God, and that's better than being with him, and that it would be simply a wrong, a terrible thing to bring her back if he could. It would be sinful, but that's exactly what he wants. And again, I'm not trying to force the connection with Gustafson's theory of grief, where our desire runs counter to what we know to be true. But I think it is here. All sorts of other ambivalences too in his grief. One is that you'll find is in these later chapters, he does seem to be, quote, getting better. But as he says, what does that mean? Getting better. This passage on page 52, getting it over so soon, or getting over it so soon, but the words are ambiguous. To say the patient is getting over it after an operation for appendicitis is one thing. After he's had his leg off, it's quite another, which is a brutal metaphor, but certainly he makes a very strong point. What does it mean to get over someone dying? Well, it's not like getting over appendicitis, because once you're over appendicitis, you're over it. You know, it's almost as if it never happened. But after you have your leg amputated, what does it mean to get over that? After that operation, either the wounded stump heals or the man dies. If it heals, the fierce, continuous pain will stop. Presently, he'll get back his strength and be able to stump about on his wooden leg. He has got over it. But he will probably have recurrent pains in the stump all his life, and perhaps pretty bad ones, and he will always be a one-legged man. There will be hardly any moment when he forgets it. Bathing, dressing, sitting down and getting up again, even lying in bed, will all be different. His whole way of life will be changed. All sorts of pleasures and activities that he once took for granted will have to be simply written off. Duties, too. At present, I am learning to get about on crutches. Perhaps I shall presently be given a wooden leg, but I shall never be a biped again. That's pretty powerful stuff. I mean, very powerful, I would say, and true. I mean, and again, this may go to the fact that it's his wife that he's grieving for. I think that loss of a loved one in general leaves a permanent mark on us, but perhaps the loss of a spouse is different. Perhaps the love of a spouse leaves a permanent disability of some sort, or a permanent emptiness, which is different, maybe more acute. I guess it depends on how closely we identified with that person, or how much they were a part of our everyday lives, so that living without them is just fundamentally different and always will be with than living with them was. But, I guess another thing in terms of reading this so many times and reading it at different ages is that at one time, and again, this goes along with my interest in Gustafson's definition of grief, I was very interested in the resolution of grief, whether it ever resolves. How long are you supposed to grieve? What is the time period, the normal time period for grief? How do we know we're out of grief? What does it take to get beyond grief, or for grieving to end? I guess those are good questions, I still think. But perhaps I'm at an age where I'm not quite as interested in resolutions. I don't really believe in closure, and I guess I'm not as interested in the question of whether by the end of this, Lewis is ready to, as we say, move on. Well, he's definitely worked some things out. He's definitely not where he was in the beginning. But that question is still there. I don't know if I'll be able to find this section. Maybe I will. There's a great passage here where this is on page 60, where I think this question of resolution comes up. He says, we start out here. This is the beginning of chapter 4, where he says, I'm not going to buy any more. I've almost filled this notebook I'm using to record these thoughts, and I'm not going to buy another one. I'm just going to stop, which I think is really interesting. I mean, it's almost as if he is admitting that he has not come to the conclusion of this thing, that he's just going to stop at an arbitrary point. He says here towards the bottom, I thought I could describe a state, making a map of sorrow. Sorrow, however, happens to be not a state, but a process. It needs not a map, but a history. And if I don't stop writing that history at some quite arbitrary point, there's no reason why I should ever stop. Now, that's an incredibly interesting thought. And that contrast between something being a state, just like a frozen sort of, just this is the way you are. And that would be the way that Gustafson is describing it, the grief as a state. Whereas Lewis is saying, no, it's not a state. It's a process. It has a history. It could, because it's constantly changing. It's something you go through when there are different. Well, I mean, obviously the Kubler-Ross thing about stages is something similar, although he doesn't suggest there are any stages here. But that there are different stages. But the thing about the Kubler-Ross thing is that the 5 stages of grief, or whatever they are, denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, things like that, is that they're linear. They move towards a resolution. And that's exactly what I'm questioning here. And I think that what Lewis is questioning, maybe there's stages, but stages towards what? He says, this is the top of page 60, there is something new to be chronicled every day. Grief is like a long valley, a winding valley, where any bend may reveal a totally new landscape. As I've already noted, not every bend does. Sometimes the surprise is the opposite one. You are presented with exactly the same sort of country you thought you had left behind miles ago. that is when you wonder whether the valley isn't a circular trench. That is a very interesting metaphor. For if you're interested in the question of resolution of grief, how does grief resolve itself? How do we get out of grief? Do we actually stop grieving? Well, that would depend upon whether we believe that grief is like a valley where you're walking through something that has, the mountains surround you, but eventually if you go through the valley, you get out. Or whether you think it's a circular trench where there's no getting out. You're just walking through it again perpetually. That's a very interesting question, I believe. But then he immediately says it isn't. That is, it isn't like a circular trench. There are partial recurrences, but the sequence doesn't repeat. At other points, I believe his metaphor is a spiral. Yeah, this is on page 56. Where he does seem like he's getting better. It seems to himself that at least the pain and suffering is getting less. But he says here towards the bottom, an admirable program unfortunately can't be carried out. Tonight, all the hells of young grief have opened again. That is, he feels like he's back exactly where he started. Tonight, all the hells of young grief have opened again. The mad words, the bitter resentment, the fluttering in the stomach, the nightmare unreality, the wallowed in tears. For in grief, nothing stays put. One keeps on emerging from a phase, but it always recurs, round and round. Everything repeats. Am I going in circles, or dare I hope I am on a spiral? You see the difference there between circles, where you're just going around and experiencing exactly the same thing forever, or a spiral, which would be, well, okay, you're experiencing some of the same things. You're going backwards to earlier states, but overall, if you think of a spiral, you're eventually going forward. You're eventually, or at least going to a new place, not exactly where you were before. And that's where he says, but if a spiral, am I going up or down it? That is, things are changing in my mood, in my life, but am I getting better or am I getting worse? What a great question. After something traumatic, devastating like this, how does a human being know if they're heading, what direction they're heading? They really don't know, I think. They just have to sort of go on. But just to leave you with one last thought that I think is really important is the way the book ends. And again, it's for you to judge what's actually being said here, and also, whether you buy it. It's a quotation from Dante, a poet, not his Inferno, I believe. That wouldn't make any sense, but somewhere else. This last line, which I won't say because I will murder it because I don't have any Italian, but it is in Italian, and if you Google it, you'll see that it says something to the effect of, then she turned towards the eternal fountain. And Dante, I believe, is referring to his great love. Oh my God, I can't remember the name. Dante's great love. Doesn't matter. And she's died. Oh my God, I can't remember it. All my teachers will hate me right now. But she's turned towards the eternal fountain. I believe the eternal fountain is a symbol for God. Beatrice, right? Dante's great love. How wicked it would be, he says, if we could, to call the dead back. She said not to me, but to the chaplain, I am at peace with God. She smiled, but not at me. And she turned towards the eternal fountain, meaning she is now with God. And that means that that Lewis himself is not important. He has to accept his unimportance to her. That what's important to her now is in a total way what was more important to her in her life, and that is God. And I believe that that's something that every religious person, especially suppose every person of the Christian variety, religious person of the Christian variety, would have to accept, is that ultimately for a Christian, the most important thing in the world is God. And however much you may love other people and be devoted to them and do for them, that is a truth in your life. Now that she's dead, she is absorbed in God. Lewis is not a concern for her. And he has to accept that in a certain sense, he's been dumped. Right? Not in any kind of mean way or any kind of arbitrary way, but in the way that the dead move on, if you're a Christian, to something else, and that the living have to accept that. And that might be the hardest thing of all. So there is something, I suppose, ambiguous about this last line, that then she turned to the eternal fountain. Lewis does not tell us whether he's accepted that or not, whether he, in his whole being, whether he affirms that she has left him for someone better, for something better.